Hello, I'm super excited to be recording this video. So in this year, I've decided to double down on creating content on this channel, and this happens to be the first video on the channel. And in this video, I'm going to be walking you through the end-to-end process of creating a full stack application, what actually goes into creating a full stack application. And the reason I'm doing this is because one of you out there asked this question. So since I've not been getting time to do the various live streams I'm supposed to be doing with you, this is the approach that I've come up with. You ask the question and I respond with a tutorial like this. So anytime that I get some free time on my hand, instead of planning a whole live stream that I'm not getting the time for right now, I would be able to respond in the form of a video. So I would share the link to the form in the description of the video. Feel free to submit any queries that you have and I'll respond to it in a video. Let's get into today's video. In today's video, as I said, the question was on how to build a full stack application from the end-to-end process from building a full stack application. And essentially, I've broken that down into seven different parts. And on my screen right now, you can see the various parts. So I'm going to walk you through the various parts and what it really entails. So if you are just beginning your programming journey and you're wondering, for me to build a fully functional application, what actually goes into it, this is exactly the various steps that you need to go through to build a fully functional application. In the first place, you're looking at planning your application. Obviously, if you want to build something, you have to sit down and think about it. What is the platform that I want to build, or what's this idea or app that I want to build? Then you plan out the various features of the app, as well as, if possible, begin to do some form of wireframing or design. So what would the interface look like? And there are various tools that you can use to assist with the planning and the wireframing or the UI design, UI UX design. And one very popular tool that you might have heard of if you've been in the space for a while now is Figma. Figma is one, so we can have Figma. You can find it on figma.com. Figma.com is one of the platforms that most designers use for designing their UI. And what I mean by this is, if you had an idea, you wanted to design a web platform that does any particular thing. In fact, you can even use tools like this, like what I'm using right now, eraser.io or Excalidraw. These are very simple tools, but all you need is, oh, I want to create something. What is it going to look like? What kind of pages will be in there? So let's assume you are creating a hotel booking website. So you try to think through it. This hotel booking website I'm going to create, what are the various pages that are going to be in there? And now try to sketch them out. So let's say the home page. What would the home page look like? So you are trying to do, let's say we have something like this, then we have other sessions. That is the process of wireframing. You are trying to flesh out the idea that you have into some form of design. Not really any fancy design, but then just to get an idea of what it's going to look like and the various pages that will go in there. Nowadays, you can even use AI to assist you in doing some of these things. In fact, you can go to ChatGPT and say, ChatGPT, give me method code. So let me mention that. Write this down. Method code for the wireframe of an application that does this. Then it'll give you that code. You can use a platform like Excalidraw, Excalidraw.com, to convert your method code. If you come to the AI tool, you can see that we have method to Excalidraw. So you can use that feature, and we even have wireframe to code. So these AI tools are here to support us, and that will be for the first part where you have planned out your concept in terms of the application and its functionality. You've come up with some wireframing UI as well. You can take inspiration from existing platforms, see how they've implemented it, and proceed to implement yours. Then The next one is choosing the tech stack, and I think that's where a lot of beginners get stuck. That I've started learning HTML and CSS. How do I know, or how do I build a full stack application? So it is not every stack that you have right now, or every stack that you know of, that will allow you to build a comprehensive or a fully fledged full stack application. So you have to understand what goes into a full stack application. There are three main things that goes into a full stack application. You need first the front end, you need a back end, and you need a database. So with these three things, then you have a fully functional full stack application. So as I said, let's write it in here. We have the front end, then we have the back end, then we have the database. So those are the three things that you need. So this means that you need some form of language or technology stack that will allow you to create front end. Most front end are essentially HTML. So those of you who have learned HTML before, HTML and CSS. Essentially HTML, CSS and JavaScript make up the most of the front end. However, there are a lot of libraries and frameworks that you can use to build this. So if you have heard of something like React before, React is essentially a JavaScript library for building the front end, or the UI if I should say. Then you come to the back end. There are a lot of programming languages or technology stack that you can use to build a back end. And examples of these include, you can use PHP, you can use Python, you can use even JavaScript in the form of Node.js. All these can be used to build a back end. So you need to have knowledge of at least one of these to be able to build a back end. Then the database too, we have different types of database. Commonly we have the SQL databases, that is the relational database, and the NoSQL or non-relational databases. The very common ones, if you take SQL, you can have, say, MySQL, you can have PostgreSQL. If you take the NoSQL, you can have something like MongoDB, which is the very popular one amongst them. Then even something lighter for the SQL will be SQLite. So you need to understand that to be able to build a full stack application, you need knowledge of at least one, or not even one. Like, you need, for the front end, you need knowledge of the stack that will allow you to build a fully functional front end, as well as the back end, then the database. But there are some frameworks that allow you to simplify this whole process so that you do not have to learn every single one of them. So if you understand, not to say you do not need to learn every single one of them, but you do not need to utilize every single one of them, because there has been some form of an abstraction and simplicity or simplification of the use of it. So for instance, when we talk about frameworks, we can have some full stack frameworks. Some full stack frameworks that I personally have used before. Currently, my number one framework of choice is Nest.js. Nest.js is essentially the web framework for React. So it's a full stack framework that allows you to build a front end and back end and easily connect to a database through using just JavaScript or TypeScript, depending on your preference. Then we also have something like Laravel. Laravel is a PHP based full stack web framework. So it allows you to build a web application, full stack web application using PHP. Then we have something like Django. Django is also a full stack web application framework based on Python. So you can see that learning these things, usually when you want to build a website, there's a lot of foundation that you need to lay. There's a lot of code that you need to do. So these frameworks have done those parts for you. You do not have to go and start all over again. Don't reinvent the wheel in this case. So these frameworks allow you to ignore all those foundations. They've built it for you, so just focus on your application itself and its functionality. However, some of them come with their own learning curve, and you need to master how to use it in order to appreciate it or be able to build something with it. I personally have experience building with all these three frameworks, but currently my preference is Node.js with TypeScript. So maybe in subsequent videos we'll delve deeper into using something like Node.js to build a full stack application. But for now, just understand that it's either you are going with these individual combinations or you are using a full stack web framework to be able to build it. If you are using any of them, in fact, let's say you've captured this, because that's what the full stack application, the full stack frameworks allow you to do. They sort of abstract the UI component and the back end, and you just follow their specifications in terms of how to structure your code. That is what you need to do. But to interact with the database, there is a possibility that you go ahead and write plain database language, so the queries will be in a given language. So for instance, if you are using SQL, then you would have to write your SQL queries. Unfortunately, not so many people are conversant with writing SQL queries. So what the community has done is that the community has introduced what is known as the relational object mappers. So objects relational mappers. So that is, in simple terms, we call them an ORM. What an ORM would do, especially in the case of the relational databases like the SQL databases, what it would do is, instead of having to learn SQL and understand SQL and write your own queries, which is usually very difficult for people who are starting off this journey, you rather focus on the language that you are using. So if you're using JavaScript, or you're using Python, or you're using PHP to write your backend, you use that same language to write objects in the language, and this object would then be converted to the SQL queries, and you do not have to take care of the conversion to the SQL queries. These ORMs that you choose would have that ability to do it. So depending on whichever framework you are using, there are a lot of these that you can use. So for instance, if I'm working with a SQL database, and this could be any of them at all, one common ORM that I use is Prisma. So Prisma is one of the ORMs. You can just check it online. Prisma ORM that you can use to write queries, simple queries. You don't have to understand anything up. You don't need like a solid understanding or detailed understanding of SQL to be able to use Prisma. Just learn how to use Prisma and you should be good, at least to begin with. Over time you can advance your knowledge and get to understand fully how these SQL databases work and how you can interact with them directly without using an ORM. If you are using something like MongoDB, we have an ODM, which is Object Document Mapper, and an example of such ODM is Mongoose. So these are examples of the ODMs or ORMs. These are examples of the APIs that will allow you to allow your backend to interact with your database. So if you come to this part, what we've covered right now is, instead of writing focus queries depending on the language you're using, you are being able to interact with your database, so the interaction between your backend and your database, with the help of what we are referring to as an ORM or an ODM. That's what is happening. So you need to appreciate this. In order to build a full stack application, you need something for your front end, something for your back end, and possibly an ORM or an ODM depending on the database, so that you are able to interact with your database. Then once you have your tech stack selected, the next step is setting up your project. you want to version control your project, so you have to use git initialize a git repository and create your project in Git. The reason this is very important is so that you can always revert back if anything happens, and also being able to store your code on a platform like GitHub so that you can have access to it irrespective of where you are. Let's say I start coding on my computer today, but tomorrow I want to continue the project. However, I'm not home, so I don't have access to my computer. How then do I continue the project? We need to find a way to be able to continue the project, and this will be possible if we are doing it remotely, if we are pushing the code to GitHub. So very important for you to use version control on your project. And then the next step is, now for step 4 and 5, it depends on you, your personal preferences. In fact, I prefer mostly to build the back end before the front end. So in that case, I would go ahead and build my back end, but usually even start with my database schema. If I understand my application and how I want it to work, then I draw up the models for the database and the structure for it. In fact, there are a couple of tools even here in eraser.io. I think there is a database, an ERD design tool that you can find, or you can find some online to show you the various relationship between the tables in your database. Once you understand that, you can go ahead and use an ORM like Prisma to now create the schema for your database. Then after that, you can create the back-end interactions, so all the various routes. If you are using, depending on how you're architecting your application, if you are using something like the MVC architecture, you would create your models, you create your views, you create your controllers. So that will also, we'll talk about those ones as well. Then for the front end, you are going to use some UI library or CSS framework. You can use something like Tailwind CSS to help you style better. But the more important thing that I want to mention is, depending on how you're approaching it, you may want to create your backend first or your front end first, any of them that you create. But more importantly, you need a way for your front end to interact with your back end. When you're using any of the frameworks that I talked about, whether Node.js, whether Laravel, Django, or there are several other frameworks out there that you could use. If you're using any of these, you have to follow their own specifications in terms of how the front end communicates with the back end. But naturally, you would need what we refer to as an API between your front end and your back end. So your back end will state or have specified some endpoints that we usually refer to as the API endpoint, and your front end will be able to interact with those endpoints. So you make some calls, HTTP calls to the various endpoints. So you need to understand HTTP and how it works, the various status messages or status codes that you can use. You need to understand the various methods, HTTP methods that you can use as well. So we can dig deeper into every part of this, but in this video, my goal is to give you an oversight or overview of all the various processes and the various parts that come together to form a full stack application. So you need an API, and this API you are going to create in your backend. So your backend is going to state all of those endpoints and their functionalities, and you have some sort of controllers or business logic within your backend that handles every single call that is coming from your front end. So you can have an API call that is going to pick all the data, given set of data. Let's say if it is a hotel booking application, maybe you are going to pick all the available rooms from the back end, or that this data is coming from the database. So you make a query to the endpoint in the back end. The back end business logic understands that, oh, you are trying to get the data from the database, so let me call on the database, so the database will now give me whatever data you're looking for. then it would share it back with the front end. So that is how they are going to be able to interact. Then finally, after you have created your application, you want to test that your application is working fine. And we can do this in several forms depending on what you have done. If you've created a front end and a back end as well as your database, then you can proceed to just test them and see on the front end is everything functioning the way you want it to function. Otherwise, you can use tools like Tender Client and Postman for testing your APIs. So we have Postman and Tender Client. I used to use Postman until I discovered Tender Client, and now I sort of use Tender Client almost all the time because it's integrated into my VS Code and I do not have to go outside to be able to test my endpoint. So these are some of the tools that you can use to test your endpoint to confirm that your endpoint is working. I've also used Swagger before, where I use Swagger for documenting the API, and once you've documented the API with Swagger, you would be able to test the application as well using the Swagger UI interface. And all of these we can dig deep. If you are actually interested in learning a lot more about any of the things that I've talked about, you want me to do a deep dive into those specific ones, please go ahead and comment it down in the comment section, or use the form to submit a question or a query and I would respond to it with a video for you. Then finally, you want to deploy your application online. There are a couple of ways to deploy the application online, and it's usually how you think about it should be from what is my tech stack. The tech stack will determine where you host it and how you host it. So a lot of the time when people are just getting started, you're looking for the various free hosting options, and there are a lot of free hosting options out there that will allow you to host most projects. But the common hostings that you see out there, like you hear about various hosting platforms, majority of them are the PHP based hosting platforms. So what I mean is that for a hosting, like I do not want to mention any specific company, but most of the hosting, at least when I started coding, the various ones that I used that had cPanel, you could only host PHP based applications. And this means that if you did anything with Node.js, or say you use Nest.js, then you can't host it on those applications. Nowadays, some of these are making room for Node.js based hosting, but I personally have not used them much. So you can sign up to any of them, but before you do, try to confirm that the tech stack that you are using is supported on that platform. For instance, if you are using Nest.js, there are some other free hosting services out there that you can test it with to confirm that everything works fine. We have Vercel, which you can equally use as a premium hosting if you prefer. They are the ones behind Nest.js itself, so they made hosting Nest.js very seamless. But there are other platforms that I've tested and tried before. Render is one of them. Netlify is one of them. There is also, I think there are a couple of these. I think these are the three that I have used for most of my side projects. But outside of these, you can equally handle your own hosting on your own virtual private server or a VM in the cloud. So I personally now go mostly with the VMs in the cloud. So I would set up an AWS EC2 instance, or even Google Cloud, or set up a VM in Azure for that use. So these are some of the options. If it is just a free application, please look for one of the free options to test it with, and if it is working fine and you want to pay for usage, you can always explore using some of these. Setting these VMs up is also a bit tricky sometimes, but there are a lot of ways to go around it, and if you are interested, I would find some time to record a deep dive into how I host most of my applications on my own VMs. And if you're also interested in any other thing like hosting on Vercel, Render, Netlify, anything, just let me know in a comment section. So in summary, to build a full stack working application, there's a lot of things that you need to consider. Make sure you understand what you want to do in the first place by planning the application. If possible, do some wireframing to have an idea of how you're going to build it. Wireframes will help you, especially when it comes to building your UI or your front end. It will be very easy for you because you have what you want, like you have a pictorial view of what you want. Otherwise, you may end up struggling and spending a lot of time on designing the front end. Then once you know what you want and you've planned it out, it is very important to determine the tech stack. I personally would prefer that you choose a tech stack that you are comfortable with, or a tech stack that you want to master. So even if you are not comfortable with that tech stack right now, but it is something you are looking to getting better at, then you can proceed to choose that tech stack to learn and get better at it. After that, make sure you have set up Git and also push your code to a remote repository like using GitHub or GitLab, any of them that you prefer. You can do that. Proceed to then build your UI. Now there are a lot of UI components libraries, especially if you are using JavaScript or TypeScript. There are a lot of these. Like I personally have resorted to using ShardCN UI a lot, and even recently I've discovered another one, but I'm yet to start using it, the 21st.dev. So these are all very popular libraries. You can use Bootstrap, Tailwind CSS in itself, or any of them to be able to style your UI. And the interesting thing is that even for all of these backends, you can pair any of these backend languages up with React or any other UI library. So if you want, just focus on learning one of these and pair it up with whichever programming language you know for the backend. Then finally test your application to make sure that it's working and deploy it. Even when it comes to deploying, you can automate the process of deploying so that anytime you make changes, it is going to be updated to your server where you are hosting it. And that is how we handle it in the industry, or it is handled in the industry. And I'm happy to do a video on how to automate some of these processes, or how to set up CI/CD pipelines for you to understand everything. So if you enjoyed this video, you want to see more of it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and also give the video a thumbs up if you indeed enjoyed it. If you have any questions for me about this video or any other video, or any questions that you have, go ahead and leave it in the comments and I'm happy to respond to that. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.